Alrighty. So this evening, I plan to go over just four books.
Uh-huh.
We ended off with Philemon, um, and this evening we're gonna go through Hebrews, we're gonna go through James, and we're gonna go through First and Second Peter. Um, so let's get started.
Cool.
And just as I mentioned last week, we um, finished off with Paul's letters, or
Right.
the section that is called, Paul's letters. Those are all Paul's letters. As we'll see with the book of Hebrews, it may be one of Paul's letters. But as far as letters written and signed by Paul, we've finished those out. So now, honestly, there's a bit of miscellany involved with pretty much the rest of the New Testament, especially tonight. It's going to be very miscellaneous. And um, Next week will be actually, at least the authors that the books are attributed to next week are all one author, except one of the books. Next week will be someone different. But in general, the second, or really this last chunk of the New Testament is just kind of a lot of different sort of authors here. So
Sure.
Hebrews is a long one. So when we were going through Paul's letters, they were getting shorter and shorter and shorter.
Yeah.
And Hebrews is a big boy. It's long and it's dense. It's To me, I always in my head considered it sort of a counterpart to the book of Romans, which when we talked
Yeah.
about Romans, I mentioned how dense it is, how theological it is. It's teaching. It's a lot of teaching. He's setting out
Yeah.
um, he's setting out theology. He's talking
Hmm.
about the way the world is, the way God operates, and all of that stuff. So Hebrews does the same thing, and not only does the same type of thing, but it's really the same type of matter. It's really deeply about salvation. It's deeply about what Jesus did and why. And it's so wonderful. In Romans, um, it's kind of doing a couple of different things. There's like, I think it's 9 chapters at the beginning of Romans, which is that sort of one line of thought. Basically, is really laying things out step by step, and then he sort of changes subject and talks about the nation of Israel, and then gets into some practical um, commands and things like that to his readers. Whereas Hebrews, man, start to finish, all, I don't remember how many chapters it is, but it's a long one, and they're all one big thought, and it for people that are really into you know that type of stuff, the teachings and things like that. It's, oh man, it's amazing. And um it gets into, like I mentioned, specifically, for people who are wondering, why did Jesus have to die? Why did he die? What did that do? This Go to Hebrews. This is really
Yeah.
tells you why Jesus did what he did. And it really specifically also gets into um, the Jewish law. I mean, most people hopefully know Christianity um, grew out of Judaism.
Sure.
And so why did Christianity all of a sudden sort of say, no, we're not going to be Jewish anymore. We're going to now be something different. Why did they make that change? This book explains that. It explains that transition. It explains Jewish laws and regulations and how Jesus fulfilled those. He freed his followers from the bondage that, that teaches, that was sort of these high expectations that no one could fulfill.
Yeah.
Teaches how Jesus sets Christians free from that. So really gets into that kind of stuff. And interestingly too, it talks about how Christians are perfect. They're sort of made these new perfect beings, and they're they can kind of like walk up to God and not be afraid.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of this interesting message in there about the nature, the status of Christians, and kind of how we can walk around now. It says you can boldly come before God and things
Sure.
like that. So it's really, for Christians, it's a very kind of warm book, and it's really gets into the security that Christians have in Jesus by faith. So it's a pretty cool book, I think. So the authorship, like I alluded to, it's traditionally ascribed to Paul, but again, it's not. I mean, even by the way the New Testament is organized, it's kind of got this question mark on it. And that, for one, is because Hebrews, unlike all of Paul's writings that we've gone over so far, Hebrews isn't signed by Paul. It doesn't say, like all of the others say, hey, I'm Paul writing to you so-and-so folks. It doesn't say that. It does have some, at the end, it's got some of those trademark greetings, say hi to so-and-so and do this and do that. And this guy who's with me says hello, things like that. It's pretty brief, but it does do a little bit of that, but it's not signed by Paul. And also a lot of the resources I went to noted how it doesn't read quite exactly like an epistle. It almost reads more like a sermon. It's kind of a bit of a different genre than an epistle, a letter. It's kind of like a sermon. It's addressed not to one specific church, but sort of to a type of believer, specifically Jewish Christians. It's kind of just addressed to Jewish Christians in general. So it's got a little bit of that different flavor where it's just, hey, this is kind of to all of you Jewish Christians. And so it's a little different than the other sermons.
I think he's trying to reinforce Christianity in the Jews.
Yeah.
That are believers.
Yeah, definitely. Reinforcing it and kind of explaining that there's a hard break, basically, between Judaism and Christianity. There's sort of it's not, Christianity is not just a new sect of Judaism. It's
right.
God's dealing with people in a different way now.
Sure.
So another little thing that makes people go, well, maybe it's not Paul, is just at the beginning, I think it's the first or the second chapter, he says something like, he alludes to people who saw Jesus in person, and it kind of sounds like he's not quite including himself in that group, whereas in all of what we know of Paul, he has always included himself. I'm one of the ones who saw Jesus, learned from Jesus directly. I'm one of the apostles. I'm no different. We've seen that in the prior videos where he argues, for his sort of equality with the apostles, of course, mixed in with huge amounts of humility and things like that. He sort of wrestles with having to argue that point. But so some people read that and they go, well, see, he's not, whoever wrote Hebrews doesn't include himself as one of the people who saw Jesus, which it doesn't say that. I mean, I get how it could sound like that. It certainly sounds a little different. It sounds at least humble, like, well, those guys saw Jesus and learned from him, but it doesn't say that the person writing didn't. It just sort of is silent on that point. And so, and then, people say, well, he uses words and phrases like Paul, and he definitely does. I mean, there's a lot in there. He sounds like Paul. He mentions his close companion Timothy, which Paul does as well. And though some people have doubted, well, maybe this isn't Paul, there's really never in history been any other solidly proposed author. There's been conjectures. Of course, you can throw out any of the biblical characters and say, well, maybe it was that person and because of this and that. But as far as like early, no one raised their hand early and said, well, yeah, the book of Hebrews was written by Jim Bob over there. It was kind of always this matter of either it was Paul or we're not so sure. So just in my readings of the resources, I would cautiously just say it's probably Paul. I don't know that it's a huge deal if it's not. It's clearly in line with everything else in Scripture. I mean, it's a heck of a book.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I would say it's probably safe to say that it's Paul.
Because the content, it makes me believe that.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it fits. It really, really fits with Paul's thinking, and of course, just with the thinking of a lot of the authors in the New Testament. They have similar thinking. Obviously, I mean, they all play off of the same events and teachings and things like that. I mean, they all learned from the same guy, Jesus. Yeah. So, but yeah, definitely
that would be amazing, like wouldn't it?
Oh. Yeah. Yeah. So being that it was written by Paul, it would have had to have been written prior to his death in about 64. So people think 62, 64 approximately for the dating of this. In addition, even if you say, well, it wasn't Paul, it was known by Clement of Rome, our resident earliest non-New Testament writer. In 96, he wrote about the book of Hebrews. I guess he really liked it. He liked it so much that's one of the people say, well, maybe he wrote it because he really, really liked it. I'm like, maybe, but I don't know. So it had to definitely have been written prior to Clement. And as we keep coming back to this big old fat date in history, 70 AD is when the temple was destroyed. This book really doesn't seem to be aware of that. It's all about, the Jewish ways and the Jewish laws and things like that. And it would seem odd to write after the destruction of the Jewish temple, and especially if it was written after, to not address it. So it was probably written for 70. Another interesting thing as far as dating goes is it says something to the readers that you guys haven't suffered to the point of bloodshed yet. The Christians are always being persecuted, and the writers are saying, stand strong, it'll be all right, things like that. And in this one, he says, it's tough, but you guys haven't really shed any blood yet. And if that's the case, then it was probably before 64, which was when Nero started his persecutions, and he shed blood. So
when was Stephen stoned?
Stephen was pretty early. I don't know exactly.
So he's probably the first martyr, and
I think that's what they say. Yeah, he was the first martyr. That's when the persecutions were mostly coming from the Jews at the beginning part of the Christian church. Is most persecutions were coming from the Jews, whereas you get to about 64, and that's when Rome turns on Christians, they turn on Jews. And then Christian persecution is mostly coming from Rome, and it's organized and nasty stuff. So if you read a letter and it seems like, well, you guys are getting persecuted, but it's not so bad, you're not bleeding over it or anything, you're just kind of you're sort of getting ran out of cities, maybe is kind of how Hebrews reads. So then it's probably before 64. So that is the dating. So definitely I would say a lot of the resources I read allude to that this book is the most hotly debated book as far as authorship. So if you want a mystery book, it's almost like a joke, if you like John, you're someone very wise, I would say, oh, so John, the author of Hebrews then, do you? It's like just kind of like a joke because it's such kind of a mystery. It's at least the most hotly debated as far as authorship, and I think it's fair to say, I think it's safe to say Paul. I think if you want to say it's anyone else, it's, you can do that, but it's pretty conjectural.
Yeah.
So very fantastic book. One of my favorites.
Me too. I can, every time I read it, I get something new out of it because it's so rich. Just like Romans.
Yeah. Yeah, it is rich. And I've always kind of thought it's sort of the sister, it's like Romans is the main teaching of Christianity to non-Jews, and Hebrews is like the main teaching of Christianity to Jews, is kind of how I always had it in my head.
Yeah.
On to James.
Cool.
So
Jimmy, huh?
The Bible. Yeah. It be flipping through a Bible and you get through Hebrews. If you really want to tackle some more reading, then you'd start reading James. So this book, by its name, is attributed to a guy named James. We can start with that. The authorship is kind of fun with James because there's 2 to 3 different Jameses in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Most people think there's 2 Jameses. Some people think there's actually 3 different Jameses spoken of. A lot probably existed at that time, but the ones that we learn about in the New Testament are 2 or 3. And one of, let's say there's 2. One is a very minor character. We don't really know much about him. The other is the brother of Jesus.
Right.
And so he's a pretty big guy just because of that. He grew up with Jesus, related to him by blood. And not only that, but later became sort of the head guy of the Christian church in Jerusalem, which was a pretty big church. So,
sure.
So just by that alone, most people think is maybe that other James who actually sort of made a name for himself. We don't really know much about the other one. I don't know why anyone would really think it was him. I could probably leave it at that. Basically, this second James, the James brother of Jesus, there's a place where he's referred to, and it doesn't specifically say James, the brother of Jesus. It describes him with some other terms, and so it's like, well, is that the same James, the brother of Jesus? I think most people think yes, so they're one and the same, but some people think, well, that's yet a third James who we also don't know a whole lot about. So I'll leave it at that. It's kind of interesting to read about. So not only was James the brother of Jesus, someone pretty big and influential, but as I mentioned, he was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and this letter happens to be addressed to the church in Jerusalem. And so even more kind of reason to think is probably that James, which is kind of interesting. I always think that must be really interesting, calling your brother the Son of God. That would take a lot for me to refer to my brothers,
or it'd be so honoring.
Yeah, well, yeah,
and humbling.
yeah, wow. But yeah, you definitely would have to have a lot of humility to
even accept
brother,
it.
The Lord of all things is my brother. So kind of interesting. The book it's fairly short. It's kind of cutting, sort of goes back to some of those letters where they're sort of like, you guys, get your act together. It is famously the book of like works, the book of action. He's telling his readers, you guys cannot be Christians in name only. You've got to act like it. You got to walk the walk. And
not to be saved by right.
And then there's also a little bit in there, but just against pride, being prideful, against favoritism, things like that. is probably getting into like the unity, you know, that Paul's always calling for unity. Don't have these like favorite teachers that you ascribe to, and teachers, if you're teaching, don't be prideful, and you know, just my way is the best way. Really pointing back to just unity, and it's all about just we are Christians, we are devoted to Jesus, period, end of sentence. So that's kind of the style of this epistle. Let's see here, let's look into authorship a little. Oh yeah, kind of an interesting thing about authorship. It's signed by James, a James, you know, James, the disciple of Jesus, whatever. And but interestingly, it's not signed, you know, James, the blood brother of Jesus. You know, it's not signed that way, which is interesting. You would think, you know, if someone was forging it or whatever, writing it, you know, as James, the brother of Jesus, they certainly would have signed it as such. And I mentioned before, especially in my first video of the Gospels, of these sort of trademark acts of humility, sort of probably unintended, you know, always it's like if it's that author, you know, they disinclude something you would think they would include to sort of boost their creds, you know, and so it just kind of is a little hint to me that yeah, it's probably, you know, sort of the Christian thing to do if you're the brother of Jesus, to just kind of leave that out. You know, I'm not
I'm not
in front of
for
their
that.
faces.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna wave that in front of their faces. You know, they know it's not a part of, you know, why they should listen to what I'm writing. And I didn't mention that, but with Hebrews also, you could, I've read it. I didn't find anyone that I read these last couple of weeks when I studied, but I know I've read it before where some people think Paul didn't sign Hebrews because so Paul is sort of designated as the apostle to the Gentiles or the non-Jews. He's sort of the head guy for the non-Jews, and Peter, you know, the rock of the church and all that, he's like the guy for the Jews. Not that, you know, they certainly cross evangelize, and it's not like, well, I'm only going to teach to these guys, you only teach to these guys, but, you know, that's just generally going to be kind of the people I, you know, shepherd and things like that. So they think, well, if this was Paul writing, you know, maybe he really had something he wanted to say sort of to Jewish Christians, but since that was kind of not his primary flock, he's just going to sort of not going to, you know, say, well, hey, I'm Paul, an apostle, just like all the other apostles, and listen to me. He didn't want to step on, you know, toes or anything, and so he just sort of left himself out of it as much as he could, and just sort of let the message speak for itself. I think that's perfectly reasonable. You know, of course, it's just thinking about things and thinking that makes sense. But that would be kind of one of those little humility acts that we sort of keep seeing. All right, so let's rock on. As far as dating, so James was martyred in 66, so it had to be written prior to that. One of the sources I read puts this epistle between Paul's 2 imprisonments. You know, we mentioned earlier, Paul was imprisoned 2 times, and they said, well, based on internal evidence of this epistle, is written between those 2 imprisonments. They didn't really say much more than that, so I don't really know where they're getting that, but that would put it sort of in the 60s. One other person, which I think at least gave their reason, which was a little more convincing to me, they put it much earlier. So James was written, the time frame is actually pretty large on this one. It's like between 45 and 62, which usually we have a bit of a narrower range. So it's probably more of an or rather than a range. It's probably more like 40s or early 60s is probably a better way to think of it, depending on sort of the clues you're pulling out of this epistle. But one person said, well, the letter, it refers to Christians being in synagogues in a somewhat, like a peaceable way. At the very beginnings of Christianity, they were
Right.
going to synagogues and they were just sort of preaching Christianity from synagogues, and they were allowed to do so. Sometimes they were ran out of town, sometimes not. So that would mean, is probably pretty early that this was written, because it's talking about Christians being in synagogues. So I think that's, a fair sort of clue to pull out.
Sure.
And if that's the case, if this was written, in the early 40s like that, then this would actually be our earliest known documentation of Christianity, rather than First Thessalonians.
Yeah.
Just kind of interesting there. And I'll just mention, for the sake of time, we're not going to get into theology too much, but so much of the space in the resources I looked at was taken up, when they're talking about James, was taken up by the concept of justification by faith alone, or justification by works. So to non-theologically inclined folks that might be watching, the Christian doctrine is that people are saved by faith alone. Their sins are washed clean by having faith in Jesus, and sort of giving their lives to Jesus, and changing their minds and their hearts, and repenting of what they've done, and just I believe in what you've done. That's enough to warrant my justification, before God. Kind of that Hebrews things, I can now come boldly before God. So that's called justification by faith. You have faith, God says you're good. So James sounds like he's saying something kind of different. He's like, well, because the whole theme is you guys can't just be Christians in name only. And he goes at that point so hard that some people are a little uncomfortable. Like, this sounds like, is he talking like that's how we get saved, is that we work really hard and we earn it, rather than that faith thing that Paul was talking about? So I won't get into, everyone I looked at, is like, well, here's why they're not contradictory, right? Because they're saying different things, but they're not saying contradictory things. And I think they're probably right, but it is sort of a dense point to get into. But it's good to know that James is the place where that happens. If someone's saying, you've got to earn your way into heaven, that type of belief system, they're probably pulling it from James. So
right. And I think he's trying to tell us that if we're born again, the fruits of our faith is good works.
Right.
Only.
Right.
Faith comes before works. Right.
Yeah, there's certainly, I don't know if sides of the same coin is the right way of putting it. But his Paul's, this is just off the cuff, but Paul's main audience were, it seemed like he was writing to a lot of people who were trying to bring, the Jewish ways into the church. Is sort of a couple different types of people. Some were trying to bring sort of philosophy and the Greek religion into the Christianity, and some were bringing the Jewish religion, trying to kind of bring some of that back into Christianity. And so many of the people he was writing to were trying to do that. We've got to get circumcised. We've got to do all these sort of hard things on top of the faith thing. And so Paul really had that to combat. It sounds like James had a whole other problem on his hands, where he just had folks going around saying, well, we can do whatever we want, and doesn't really matter, we've got faith, we're good. So they're both definitely dealing with separate problems. So alrighty, 1st and 2nd Peter. So they're both, I would call these sort of the persecution letters, if you want to have it in a sentence. That very much Peter is dealing with some anxiety maybe in his audience. There's a lot of persecution going on, and he's writing to his readers to encourage them. say it's all right, everything's good. Our hope is not in this world. Our hope is on, Jesus and his return, is making things right, things like that. So that's really, in a quick nutshell, what his letters are about. And he also calls, at least in his first letter, he calls again, just like James and Paul and everyone has, for this Christian unity. Let's all be of the same mind. The first letter is definitely Peter. I mean, everyone I read is for sure Peter. He's quoted by the early church fathers. Sounds like Peter. It uses, I found some of the best evidence, because some of these guys just sort of say things and they don't really quite explain what they mean. But one of these resources I read really matched up phrase for phrase ways that First Peter was written compared to sermons Peter gave as quoted in Acts. Way back when we read Acts' history, and Luke, was writing about all these guys and the things they did and said, and all these times when in Acts Peter was quoted as giving a sermon, he says things in like just the same way as the writer of First Peter. Phrases that no one else in the New Testament is sort of phrasing it this way, and here's Peter doing it the same. And so that's kind of this fun. I love those unintended confirmations of authenticity, you could call it. So that was cool to just see, because a lot of people in resources that say stuff like that, and I get it, there's space, but this one really laid out just all these times that it was parallel. So definitely Paul. Paul was martyred probably in 66, so it had to have been written before that, maybe as early as 63. Not a ton of like reasonings that I really come across as far as the dating, but just using my head, obviously it had to be before he was killed, but it had to be sort of late enough for persecutions to start, either to start or for Christians and people to sort of start feeling a little uncomfortable, like they were coming down the pipe. So it had to be kind of in that later time, leading up to Nero, or at least maybe even as Nero had begun his persecution. So that's probably why it's kind of in the 60s there. So that's First Peter. It was a pretty simple one, and it was definitely an epistle, back to these kind of just, they're personal, they're to a specific church. This one was very encouraging. It was I don't know if I'd call it a practical epistle, but it wasn't primarily teaching. It was primarily to encourage them and tell them it's okay, keep on keeping on, type of thing. And Second Peter, so this one is just like Hebrews, is most hotly contested as far as who the author was. Second Peter is the most hotly contested as far as whether it really even belongs in the New Testament.
Oh, really?
And part of that goes, part of that goes with the author and not being so sure. This is definitely one of those where a lot of people are like, I don't know if this should be in here. And it really is down to, we're not sure if Peter wrote this, because just like always, it sort of sounds a little different than Peter. And I didn't know, I guess there's people in the ancient times who were saying this about Second Peter, which I didn't really know, that I knew it was a modern practice to be able to sort of look at the way things are said and compare. I didn't really know they were doing that in ancient times. I didn't know ancient people were sitting around going, this doesn't really sound like him. I just don't, a lot of times we're sort of arrogant in the modern day, thinking, well, we're the only ones who can sort of analyze and be smart. And they were kind of doing it too in the ancient times, and just saying like, I don't know, this sounds a little different, which to me anyway, it's good to note. And to me, it's not a smoking gun, I guess, is, well, they sound a little different, because we can all sound different at times. But it's a fair thing to note. And a lot of people, I read noted, well, for just as much as it doesn't sound like him, it even more so does. You know, you can point out 5 places where it doesn't sound like him, and in 20 places it really does sound like him. And so it's not just, well, none of it sounds like him. It's there's some of it that doesn't.
Yeah.
And kind of again with Hebrews, it's like there's this suspicion with um, things not written to specific people. Second Peter was kind of more of a general address. It wasn't like, hey, church over there in Galatia, how's it going? Bob, Joe, is just to Christians in general. And so that made people go, is this someone just writing stuff? But it was signed by Peter. I mean, both First Peter and Second Peter were signed as the Apostle Peter. And not only is it signed as Peter, but it's also presents itself as a follow-up to the first letter. Addresses things that he wrote in the first letter. So it's definitely written as if from Peter. And people, if they say, well, it's not written by Peter, they kind of try to save face. And every book so far, all the books I've read in the New Testament, the ones that are disputed even a little, the people that dispute it seem to say, well, it's not like a totally worthless thing, or it doesn't belong in there. Is written by like a close follower who really knew his thinking and the way he put things, and they maybe even used some of his words that were heard in person or writing. I mean, they really want to save the book almost in like it's almost as if it was Paul, right? It wasn't written by Paul, but it was someone who really represented him well. And it's just kind of interesting. I mean, because that doesn't work with Second Peter. I don't think I'd buy Second Peter as, well, it's a friend of Peter's who's just really trying to present Peter well and faithfully. And I'd say, I don't know, I wouldn't want this in here if that was the case, because there's some deception then, because whoever's writing this is presenting it as if it's from Peter, as a follow-up.
Right.
So
Right.
So I'd say that's fine and dandy. Maybe there's some good stuff in there, but if it wasn't written by Peter, I don't know. Someone who's got at least a little sort of deception going on in there. So personally, I say, well, yeah, it's probably written by Peter, as kind of another one of those things where there's really no other contenders out there. In ancient times, there was just this. Some people had this sort of cautious attitude towards it, and it wasn't officially. There's sort of the split where the East and the West, I can't remember which, but one sort of whole chunk of Christianity basically said, yeah, let's not really include that. Up until almost 400, it was finally like this was Peter, this is Scripture, and so it really was sort of the last one to kind of sneak in there. But even despite all that sort of uncertainty, just really no other contenders for authorship other than Peter. I mean, it was signed as if by Peter. So I personally say, well, it sounds like him and all that. So I'd go with Peter. If you want to know a fun word, this is considered in the Antilegomena, which just means just means spoken against, or a disputed book, a book that made it in, but there were some folks early on in sort of Christianity that said maybe not that one. So an Antilegomena is a book that wasn't 100% unanimous, but it's not apocrypha, it's not pseudepigrapha. Right. Those are ones that either almost no one thought should be in the canon, or literally no one thought should be in the canon. So there's a fun word for you.
Sorry,
John. I think that wraps me up. I suppose just the last thing that could be mentioned with Second Peter is there's a whole chapter in there that people note that it sounds and looks almost exactly like Jude. We're going to get to Jude next week. And that's probably primarily where the difference in like verbiage is in this one chapter. He either maybe uses Jude.
I'll catch you later. It's my sister.
Okay. Okay. See you, John.
No, I keep on going.
Oh, okay. All right. So yeah, there's just one chapter that it really parallels Jude. And that's the one where he sounds a little different. And so I think, well, maybe he used Jude's thought there or something. And so it's interesting. You go and read and you go, yeah, these really do sound a lot alike. Kind of like, I think it was Ephesians and Colossians, or I didn't even need someone to tell me. I just go, wow, these are very similar. And, that was Paul sort of using his own thought to write something very, very similar again. It's not something that wasn't possible for them to sort of use either their own thoughts over again in very similar ways or to use someone else's. So just a fun little note.
Yeah, cool.
And that is it for this evening. What do you think?
I like it. When these were written, they're written in scrolls.
Yeah.
And the scribes had to be diligent in scribing, translate, or not putting down on the scroll exactly what they said. And there's where some of the confusion might come, or doubt, maybe.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, is literary criticism.
Yeah.
And how to, because you hear people say, people who think, I'm not saying, I think you can take the New Testament as being at least an accurate record of what people thought, what the writers thought in their heads. I think you can do that. You have to be a Christian to do that. But people who say, no, you can't, we can't even get back to what Peter and Paul and those guys thought in their heads. We don't even know really what they wrote. They'll say, well, we just have, translations of translations of translations, sort of a copy of a copy of a copy type thing. And it misunderstands transliteration for translation.
Right.
So what you're talking about is transliteration. We do have literal copies of copies of copies, although some are maybe just copies or copies of copies. I mean, there's there's some very early manuscripts and things that we have, but a lot of them, there's copies of copies, but that doesn't mean it's Greek to Spanish to French to whatever, and we don't have the original language yet. That's what you can just tell people is I'm not saying you got to believe everything in there is true, but it really seems like we do know what they wrote, at least, and what they thought, because you just say, we've got the original language. We have the original, what they wrote originally. We don't have their original papers. It'd be like if I scanned you a copy of my notes for Bible study tomorrow, you'd say, I've got what Dustin wrote for Bible study. I've got exactly what was in his head at the time when he was preparing for Bible study. I don't have the original. I don't have, the paper he wrote on, but I have, the original. And so that's kind of the same sense in which we've got the original thoughts and writings, just not the physical original stuff. So people probably don't understand that. So, well, fun stuff. So I got 5 to do next week.
Cool.
And that'll finish this off, and I'll be done. Then I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'll go join gym or something.
Well, it'll be cold out then.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
cooling
so,
out.
Right. Well, very good.
Well, thank you for
tuning
inviting
in,
me.
John.
You
Yeah,
bet.
you bet. It's always
Take
a
care.
pleasure.